We have 5 panelists today going through an agenda, or 4 panelists, I'm sorry, going through the agenda on Shift in Migration Patterns of Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Needs by Jill Caniff, myself. Then the Community Land Trust Solutions for the Emergent Hybrid Work Geography in Virginia with Jim Russell. And then Affordable Housing Solutions, Leveraging Housing Finance Agency Mortgages and Community Seconds by Regina Pinkney. And Opportunities to Fill NOVA's Housing Market Gaps, Building on Best Practices. And then following this webinar, just a heads up, in October, we're going to have a symposium for leaders of the region from the nonprofit sector, the academic sector and government sectors, and business professionals and realtors that are all leaders that want to drive change and action and create solutions to these middle income and first-time homebuyer needs of our region. So that's October 6th, a follow-on to today's session, which is more on what's the solutions to date and what has our region done currently on the issue. But you also will hear the study that I authored on the migration patterns of Northern Virginia. So I'm going to turn it over to Carol, and she will take it from here.
Thanks, Jill. Just real briefly, everyone, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to sharing this data and this informative webinar with you all today. As you know, today's Zoom is in a webinar format, so to involve as many of you as possible for discussion and questions, we ask that you put any questions into the Q&A box during the presentation, and we will take the time at the end of all presentations to respond and take you off mute if needed. Additional comments may be added to the chat, but again, so that we can be sure to see them, only put questions into the Q&A box. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be uploaded to NVRC's YouTube page and website following the event. All right. Now, with our first presentation, I'll pass it over to Jill Caniff. A little bit about Jill. She's the Senior Regional Demographer, GIS Analyst here at NVRC, where she manages the organization's demographics, the data, and the GIC programs. Her demographics career has included over 20 years in government in the Northern Virginia region and additional years in the private sector. She has been with the NVRC Regional Commission since 2019. Jill has applied her demographic, GIS, and data management and analysis expertise extensively to the realm of government service planning, urban planning, economic development, and resiliency planning. And Jill will be presenting again on the shifting migration patterns of Northern Virginia affordable housing needs. Jill?
Good morning, everyone. So thank you, Carol, for that introduction. I will be presenting on the domestic migration shifts and the study that we just completed here at Northern Virginia Regional Commission that was published in January 2025. So I'm going to go through the background on domestic migration, which was the primary migration type that was analyzed in this report that we're presenting on today. There is also international migration, but that is not the topic of today's discussion. It's domestic migration, pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, and then the impact on the population and local communities that this migration shift has had. And we'll talk about the volume of migration in and out and the housing affordability impacts and the demographics that are shaping this migration trend. The report can be found at the URL and QR code shown here on this page. So the purpose of the report was that there was a lot of foundational information that was widely reported about people moving out of large, high-cost metropolitan areas in our country, such as San Francisco and New York and DC. And that was the case for Northern Virginia as well, and still is the case and has been for over a decade. It's because people are moving from the large cities and urban areas to seek lower cost of living, seeking more affordable housing, and young first-time home buyers are moving out because their incomes are not high enough to be able to afford the cost of living in these higher cost areas such as Northern Virginia. This pattern was occurring pre-pandemic for moving out, but the pandemic has accelerated it. There were 3 unreported elements to date on Northern Virginia that were unanswered and that the report research and study has answered. And that is, what is the scale of the in and out migration impact on Northern Virginia? How much has been occurring? What's the volume? And what specific destinations are the Northern Virginia residents who are leaving? Where are they going? And what's the volume and extent to which housing affordability, income, and age are playing a role in migrations? So that's what we will be covering here. So the key highlights and impacts of Northern Virginia's migration shifts are slower employment growth. We are now competing with many more affordable regions on an economic level because of the high affordability, high cost, and high unaffordability for our region, both from a commercial standpoint, where our costs for rentals and all are very high, and from a housing standpoint, the costs are very high on the rental side as well as the owner side. And so this high cost of living has really caused a slowing of the population growth and the slowing employment growth. Since the pandemic, the rise of remote and hybrid work has led to affordable quality living conditions being prioritized over proximity to work. So that is a brand new phenomenon we are now facing, at least at an accelerated pace compared to what we were used to before the pandemic. And the high living costs are driving and keeping young adult workers away, which is an issue for our business community. And the report illuminates the urgent need for middle income and first-time homebuyer attainable housing and desirable product types, specifically because condos and smaller homes are not ideal for, especially for those who want families and want to grow their families. And the middle income and first-time homebuyers don't have enough product type that for spacious living in our region. So that's a need we all need to work on together to see if we can move the needle on that. The rental housing also is illuminated in the reports, the need for more middle income young adult housing to meet their needs. And it amplifies the need for businesses struggling to retain and attract young, talented workers to continue offering remote or hybrid work, or upskilling employees and higher wages is going to be needed to be able to retain and attract the young workers. But particularly, I want to emphasize the remote or hybrid work. This new generation, the youngest, really desires that, and the changes that come with society over time are really something that businesses have to just acknowledge and be willing to accept. And accepting it has its benefits for giving the young people that are highly educated a better opportunity to live in a quality environment, but still work close by, within commuting distance, like an hour away or something, a few times a week. Whereas the negative, obviously, is to the business community, like small businesses and restaurants. They need the business during the daytime. So finding the balance between all of this is what we've all got to work together on, I believe. And certainly, even if we brought everybody back to work 5 days a week, I personally don't believe that we would find that would be good for our community, and that you would get more people leaving. You get more young people leaving. So there's really no end in sight for these young people really having to move out of our region, whether or not there's 5 days a week or not. So the best is the hybrid work. There's also foregone tax revenues, and there's a widening income gap between young adults and older adults in our community that we're experiencing. So I'll go through all these findings now. So we have had slower growth in our region, though our 2024 numbers just came out these past 2 weeks, which those showed some of our highest growth that we have had since 2013, 2014, when at that time we had over 28,990 back then. And the latest numbers showed more than 30,000 growth in our region. So we really came back. But the main driver of that growth was the international community. We did slow down on our domestic migration out of the region back to the pre-pandemic levels. But we have certainly grown in the realm of the international migration. So in terms of the domestic migration, which you're seeing here in this report, this is the types of migration and changes in our population. You've got the domestic migration in the blue, which is negative, meaning we have more people moving out to other parts of the country than moving into our region from other parts of the country. Whereas the international migrations, you're light pink, and that reached one of the highest levels we've seen this past year with the 24 data that just came out, which is on our website on NVRC if you want to check that out. That's available. And the natural change that has been declining and going down since earlier back in 2010, when the numbers were in the mid 20,000s, way back in 2010, was now you generally see it in the upper 10,000s. And that's because of the declining birth rates. So international migration has really been key to sustaining our region's population, knowing that we're losing people because of the cost of living, as this domestic migration shows how during the pandemic from 2020 on, at least the first 2 years of the pandemic, it doubled. The out-migration doubled for our region. It then began to slow in the 22 to 23 period, 2023, and that slowing paralleled slowing throughout the nation because of the rising interest rates in our country. Rising interest rates really constrain people from moving. And I believe that's a large part of what's going on, because now that we're back to the pre-pandemic levels of 2024, the reason that we slowed greatly in the 23 to 2024 period, which is not shown since it just came out, the reason we slowed greatly is likely due to the high interest rates deterring people from being able to move, and low supply of housing on the market. And this was a national phenomenon where all of the 50 largest metro areas in our country, which include places like Austin and Nashville that have been receiving much of this out-migration, those places even slowed in their in-migration. So across the country, for the 50 largest, everybody slowed either in their net migration for the domestic. So it was not just Northern Virginia. So that really points to the fact that it likely is the housing interest rates really deterring people. So how much out-migration have we had in this region through 2022? This data comes from the IRS, which is the data source for the most detail on the out versus in, because all the Census Bureau has, which we just looked at, was net. But in terms of out-migration, 2020, we reached a high of 166,167 people leaving. our region. That's a very high amount. That we, in 2022, returned to the pre-pandemic levels, which were around 158,000. So the upper 150s was pre-pandemic. So again, very high amounts that are leaving. But we do have people coming in, but those who are coming in are not replacing those who left, which is why our net migration is negative. Our in-migration is trending down since 2018. It reached a low of 128,000 in 2022. So it's trending down rather than returning to the pre-pandemic levels like out migrants did. So this trend down is really the driver of why our net migration in our region has been elevated. And it's negative because it's attributable to fewer people migrating into the region. And I've mentioned that housing costs are really the biggest driver of all of this. And from the study, we looked at the bottom tier housing cost of home values in our region's jurisdictions, as well as compared it to the US. And we also looked at the mid-tier value from Zillow and the median from the ACS Census Bureau. So we had 3 sources here. The bottom tier is showing you the lowest cost third of homes that are in our region, not just for sale, but all homes existing and for sale. What the cost of the lowest 33% are, the bottom third. And the mid-tier is the pretty much, as it says, in the middle, those homes existing and for sale in the 35th to 65th percentile, so in the middle. And those are very comparable to the ACS numbers that you find from the Census Bureau. So both of those data sources, Zillow and ACS, complement each other and show similar results. And what you see from all of our jurisdictions is how we have some of the highest home values in our country, because the ranks are from 12th to 259 in our region, when there's over 3,000 jurisdictions in our country. And you can also see from the USA numbers that, like, the bottom tier is 191 compared to the mid 300s that our lowest cost are. So we're nearly double and triple or quadruple in some places in our region. So people are moving to these other places in the US, again, because the rest of the US, much of it, the smaller metro areas and mid-sized metro areas, have much more affordable housing. And on the fringes of urban areas such as Stafford and Spotsylvania, that's another thing that we're seeing as well. And why are they moving? These housing costs, as I said, are very high compared to the US. Housing burden is another measure of how unaffordable an area may be. And from this, you have the renters. And what's really striking is how even the middle income, highly educated in Northern Virginia, the dark brown, is way above on the bar graphs, like twice the rates of Virginia and the US at the up to 99,000. And then at the 100,000 or more for the renters, it's slightly above. It's 7.7% are unaffordable, are burdened, versus the US at 6.1%. So not a huge difference from the US in that one. Then when you look at the owners, all of these income levels are like 2 to 3 times the percent overburdened on the ownership. And it goes up to the 150,000 mark. So that's approximately 128% AMI, for those of you familiar with the area median income. So knowing that we have such a high number overburdened, this is why there is a need for more middle income housing solutions in our region, especially for the young who were not in a position to buy a home, say back in 10 or 20 years ago, when it was much more affordable. So if you have to start from scratch and buy today, you've got no equity. So you're looking for homes that would meet your housing need at 150,000 income. 150,000, if you assume 30% of your income goes to housing, that would be a house of approximately like 450,000, which, as you just saw, there's not many of them. That's less than the bottom tier that you just saw. And also the thing to keep in mind is that those bottom tiers are usually the undesirable housing types. So that's another reason people leave. Because they can't find the space they need, and they also can't find good living conditions at those bottom tiers generally. So where are the people moving to that this study showed? What you're seeing here is the 2017 to 2019 households migrating versus post-pandemic, which was 2020 to 2022. So you're comparing the conditions of where they were moving to before the pandemic versus after or during the pandemic. And what's really eye-opening is that the pink bar graphs the pink ones are the declines. There was a change, a negative change. So the lessening of people going to the DC area, the DC district, that is, Montgomery County and Prince George's. Those are all inner suburban jurisdictions, which, what do those have in common? Again, those have high housing costs. Whereas if you go out to the outer jurisdictions such as Stafford, which was second on our list for places people moved, that one, Stafford, increased by 24% in the post-pandemic period. Other jurisdictions that received huge increases included places like Spotsylvania and Frederick County, Virginia, which is Winchester, and Frederick County, Maryland. All of those places are within commuting distance if you have hybrid work situations. Most people wouldn't do that if they didn't have hybrid, but that goes to show that people are really moving to these exurbs or to smaller or mid-size, more affordable areas in our country. This is another graph showing this situation with the housing costs versus the typical income. So what this shows is that Northern Virginia jurisdictions are all above the 45-degree line, the trend line you see there. The majority of destinations below the 45-degree line indicate affordability. So lower and middle income households are moving to the more affordable areas because your money is going further, in other words. Like if you have, for instance, Frederick County, Maryland is like, I'd say about 420,000. And the incomes for people that moved there were approximately, it looks like 120,000. Whereas a jurisdiction with the same income level of 120,000 as Frederick County would be somebody like San Diego, California, which is a $800,000 home value. So obviously your money does not go as far when you have to pay more to your housing, which all of these Northern Virginia jurisdictions are above that line, meaning they are some of the most unaffordable areas. And clearly people move to more affordable areas where the money would go further. So there is a clear interconnection of housing costs and income levels and relocation decisions. What are the demographics that are shaping these migration characteristics? They're the income, the age, and the household sizes. The findings in the report that are much deeper than what I'm going into here show that there's higher income levels are the more likely ones to move the long distance and be career-based moves, such as to San Diego or New York. The lower income levels often move the short distances for more affordable housing. And that would be to, say, the Winchester area or Stafford, places like that. And age, what we saw from the analysis is that younger individuals are the ones that are more likely to migrate, as I'll show you shortly in a chart that shows the actual data. Older individuals tend to be less mobile and have settled down in a community and had the opportunity to buy a home when it was more affordable, like decades ago. In household sizes, large households face more challenges in migrating, so they're less likely, and smaller households find it easier to migrate. So that would be your young people that haven't had a family started yet, or have only like one kid, or just got married. They find it easier to migrate, and will if they can. So the young adults, they are the ones driving our migration shifts in the region. They are the highest mobility, those who are younger than 44 and under, but specifically the 30-year-olds and under have really driven it. And they are the lowest average earners among working age groups. So not being able to retain this age group because they have to move out because they can't afford is an issue that we want to work on resolving for the better of the community. There is a consistent net loss since 2018 for those people migrating that are ages 30 to 44, and it's a declining share of ages 18 to 29 that remain in Northern Virginia. And the reasons for the losses are the lack of attainable and desirable housing, like I mentioned, and larger spaces that families want. So the out-migration destinations, I've broken it down here for the out-migrants versus the in-migrants. We've got the darkest blue is at the top on each one. That's people that did not migrate. They had the highest incomes of all these groups we're looking at. We also have Northern Virginia people that moved to a different county in Northern Virginia. We are looking at Virginia, those who moved outside of Northern Virginia but stayed in the state. And then those who moved to other states, as well as those who moved internationally. So the ones at the bottom on the out-migration are those people with the lowest income, and those are people that move to the exurbs pretty much, or to places like Richmond, or smaller areas like Winchester, because of their income levels. And then the light blue is to Northern Virginians moving to a different county. Those people also were some of the lowest income. So we've got a large migration pattern from the inner jurisdictions to our outer jurisdictions in our region. And that's the phenomenon we're seeing there because of income. On the in-migrants, all the in-migrant lines that you see there have incomes lower than the out-migrant lines. For instance, those people that stayed in the region, in 2022, the income was $158,000 versus, well, that's not a good example. I'll do the brown, for instance, the Virginians, $97,346 in 2022 for the out migrants, their income, versus coming in from other parts of Virginia was 76,000. So that's like a difference of 20,000. So what that signifies is that those coming in have lower incomes than those moving out. And so if you're moving in with a lower income, you're going to have a greater gap between the highest and the lowest of incomes in our region, causing an equity issue to widen. And one of the last slides I have is the domestic migration by age. As I was mentioning, our age patterns have shown that the greatest migration over time has been out-migration has been the 18 to 24-year-olds, and that has really widened greatly since 2018. And that's a phenomenon happening in other large metro areas as well. Again, because once they graduate, they either can't afford to live here if they want to start their career right away without college, but there's also those who are moving out because they're going to college elsewhere. But this widening and greater volume is definitely attributable partly to the housing cost levels. And then on the other out migrations, during the pandemic, the 25 to 29-year-olds, as you see, were in the top three, and they still are in the top three for people migrating out. And the 35 to 44-year-olds in the top three. And then what you really saw during the pandemic was the young 30-year-olds, the 30 to 34-year-olds. In 2021, that really went up high to 20,000 and then back down to lower levels. But it shows that those who really desired to move out of our region during the pandemic, when the housing interest rates were low, were really those who wanted to start a family, because you've got the 30 to 34-year-olds and the 35 to 44 being the second and third highest during the pandemic. So that really indicates people's desire to want better quality housing and more affordable costs. And then the immigrants that are coming here are also the same age groups largely, the 18 to 44-year-olds, who are as I mentioned earlier, are the most mobile people in our country, since they haven't settled down yet. But they are not moving in at the rates that people are moving out. So we are losing our young population, is what this is showing us. And that's a problem, again, from the business community. If we can't retain the workers because they are moving out and not moving in at the same rate, that's problematic and something to be addressed. So in summary, before we move on to the next presentations, just wanted to summarize that our migration patterns and young workforce are a concern. And the high living cost and availability of affordable, attainable housing are driving the trends we're seeing. And the region's becoming less attractive to the young talent. So we're becoming a place where businesses are gonna really wanna compete for other places to possibly go. And we may not be as economically vibrant unless we address this issue. And solutions would include what you're about to see in the upcoming presentations, as well as a couple that I have listed here, which are strengthen and expand housing programs for middle income, especially the first-time home buyers, speed up the housing construction by overhauling our lengthy zoning and permitting process so we can get greater supply on the market. And governments and businesses should consider partnering to address the housing affordability issues. So that's everything that I have. But thank you very much, and we will take questions after all the presentations have occurred, whatever time is remaining.
Thanks, Jill.
Next.
All right. Our next presenter today is Jim Russell. Jim is a geographer researching the impacts of migration on housing. He is actively involved in policy and advocacy via Loudoun Habitat for Humanity and the Virginia Statewide Community Land Trust. Prior to living in Northern Virginia, Jim lived in Colorado, where he served as a planning commission for the city of Longmont. Professionally, he's done extensive work in Rust Belt cities such as Cleveland and Pittsburgh, as well as the Sun Belt Metro, San Antonio. Currently, his focus is on rural communities and their housing challenges. We welcome Jim to present us the Virginia Statewide Community Land Trust presentation. Jim?
Good morning, everybody. And Carol, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk today more about where we should engage in housing solutions, particularly for first-time home buyers, as opposed to like how we might do it. And Jill, if you could move to the next slide, I'll describe sort of the overall framework for how one does this. How do you figure out where to build or what sort of policies and where do you put them? And I think it's useful for understanding, and this is typical of geographers. It's not, focusing on one place like such as Northern Virginia. and its housing market, but how the housing market in Northern Virginia is connected to other housing markets. So it's within that kind of perspective that I'm looking at our affordability and attainability challenges for first-time home buyers. And what I'm arguing is that the Northern Virginia area is effectively, functionally part of what I would call the greater New York City housing market. And what you're looking at here is a map of uh, land values throughout the United States. And you can see, in the New York City area and Long Island, you have some of the most expensive land in the entire country. And so migration from New York City kind of bakes in those high land values. And typically what's causing the high land value is the large, massive concentration of economic activity. And when someone from New York City migrates to an area like DC, if we're talking about like at the higher end of household income, they tend to move what we call like a primary migration pattern, which is superstar city to superstar city. So we're seeing people leave Manhattan and land in the District of Columbia. And so they're leaving behind typically some of the highest cost rentals in the nation to some of the highest cost homeownership opportunities or rentals in superstar cities such as DC. And this has outsized impacts on the receiving market for these migrants. And so what ends up happening is you see almost like a diffusion in land values. So if we were to look at this over time, you would see the increase in land value in New York City being coincident with increasing land values, say, in DC to the south end of the Acela corridor to Boston at the north end of the Acela corridor. That effectively what goes on in New York City correlates very, very well with what goes on in DC and what goes on in Boston. Next slide, please. So looking at the secondary migration, so this is it's useful to think about long cycle migration patterns. And this is from 1970 in the gray, you have the metropolitan areas that they were designated by the census as places where, the area where people commuted to jobs in the center of a metropolitan area. And you can see that New York City was pretty much, the boroughs and Long Island. But fast forwarding today in this sort of like gold or orangish kind of color, you can see the expansion. And so in the DC area, imagine people coming from Manhattan to the district, and this idea of cascading migration is that they displace the households that are lower incomes than the incoming households. And so, these people coming from high concentration of economic activity, they bring wages, they sometimes bring, home equity and so forth. And the secondary migration displacement from 1970 to roughly about 2010 tended to be your typical sprawl. So, the suburban and even to some extent exurban. And so non-metropolitan areas became redesignated as metropolitan areas as people got forced out, like Jill was describing, these lower incomes forced out doing shorter distance migrations, seeking lower cost housing. And this is effectively what's changing rural areas into metropolitan areas or suburban. Next slide, please. All right. So as you get the integration of rural or non-metropolitan areas into the greater New York City housing market, and something that really started up, and I think Jill's research shows this well, is roughly for right around 2014, 2015, migration was picking up across the country. So we're finally getting out and into like the recovery from the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. So whatever new patterns were latent there, people finally started acting upon that. So what happens during a typical economic downturn is people hunker down. And what that does to housing markets is so say you're renting in DC or Arlington, and then as you do housing formation and you have more members of the household moving out to the suburbs, when that doesn't happen during an economic downturn, that means in existing housing terms, that rental is no longer vacated. So people can't move into that rental because they're waiting for the person or household to leave and find larger housing. And a new kind of migration. So you have your secondary, which is the sprawl. We're starting to see this tertiary migration of and just staying focused on Virginia and looking at policy jurisdictions that we can impact. Is that you got the New York City area coming into Northern Virginia. And then from there, the displaced, instead of going a little bit further out, which they're still doing, but what becomes more prominent is this tertiary effect where they're going to these different metropolitan areas in Virginia. And so you get this downstream effect of like the high land values in New York City causing displacements in Northern Virginia. And then from there, they're going to these, small metros and even displacing people there who are going to these like outlying counties and communities in search of less expensive workforce housing. So you get this cascading effect. And really, it's important to look at that and say, like, if you build housing in the Roanoke area where, the Roanoke is rising as a destination for people from Northern Virginia. And so it's, like 15th, if we're talking about the previous decade, to up to like 11th, some cases 9th, that people are increasingly, so it's integrating the Roanoke area into the overall New York City housing market. And this is really recent and relatively new. But that means that building housing opportunities in Roanoke may free up existing housing in the Northern Virginia area and thereby making it more affordable, more attainable. Next slide, please. All right, so what do we do about this? And without going into all the details of a community land trust, by and large, its key distinguishing feature is that it's permanently affordable. So you have your initial investment, and you're going to serve multiple homeowners. It's not just putting the subsidy in the hands of one household. It's a home that can serve over time many different households. And I think in terms of the overall labor market, it effectively acts as a rung between market or subsidized rentals and market rate homeownership. And it does this really by and large by divorcing land costs. And as I've demonstrated, on the earlier slides, this is a primary driver of unaffordability. Is the high land costs in New York City are having all kinds of cascade effects throughout housing markets that are hundreds of miles away from New York City. And what this graphic represents is that it talks about how a lot of community land trust homeowners graduate to market rate homeownership, and thereby opening that up for someone in a rental to move into there. So we could have we could move the needle on affordable homeownership in Northern Virginia by moving the needle on attainable home ownership in the Roanoke area, that these places are connected through these migration patterns that Jill has highlighted. All right, next slide, please. So just as by way of a summary of, or really what this perspective adds to it is looking at housing policy through the lens of how these housing markets are connected and understanding where people are coming from, their incomes, what part of the life cycle of migration that they're in, but primarily the outsized impact of a place like New York City, which sucks in talent from all over the United States and all over the world, effectively develops them, and their incomes increase dramatically because of the nature of the dynamic economy there and its connections to all these global places. And then when they were looking for household formation, they move places. And again, this shows up well in Jill's research, that they are people of means. They move long distances. They move for career-related reasons, and they have outsized impacts on the housing markets where they land. And the Virginia Statewide Community Land Trust is uniquely positioned to deal with that. Our jurisdiction of activity is the entire Commonwealth. And we think of the housing markets and how they're connected and what sort of affordability homeownership solutions we can create. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Up next, we have Regina Pinkney. And Regina Pinkney will be presenting on the affordable housing solutions, leveraging housing finance agency mortgages and community seconds. Regina comes to us working in the mortgage industry for over 2 decades. Regina has developed relationships with housing agencies and nonprofits throughout Northern Virginia, helping educate and empower families with low and moderate incomes. As a loan officer, she has served on the City of Alexandria's Alexandria's Neighborhood Stabilization Program Management Team, and on the Alexandria Redevelopment and Housing Authority Family Self-Sufficiency Program Coordinating Committee. She was also named a housing hero by the City of Alexandria in 2017. She currently works for Virginia Housing as the Regional Business Development Officer for Northern Virginia. In this position, she teaches lenders and real estate agents community lending practices that broaden the path to affordable home ownership for all. Regina, thank you. Oh, you're muted, Regina.
Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to join you all. So, as was mentioned, I'm the Business Development Officer for Northern Virginia for Virginia Housing, and today I want to share with you some of our information about us and our programs and how our programs pair well with other community lending products throughout Northern Virginia. Virginia Housing was created in 1972. And our mission is to provide access to affordable housing for the citizens of Virginia. We receive no federal or state funding to advance this mission. And we earn the money that we do by the sale of taxable and tax-exempt bonds, as well as by pooling loans with Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. As a housing business, as the housing finance agency for the state of Virginia, we offer wonderful homeownership programs. The first thing I'd like to share is that our interest rates are comparable to the market. We offer specialty products like a closing cost grant or a down payment assistance grant. We have a plus second mortgage that allows up to 101.5% financing. And for first-time home buyers, and we also have programs for repeat buyers. Our programs are designed to be layered with other outside down payment assistance programs. And the loans that we offer are the traditional loans that you're used to hearing about: FHA loans, VA loans, USDA loans, and conventional loans. We add our specialty products to increase affordability for home buyers to those loan products. So let's talk a little bit about how one is eligible for a Virginia housing loan. We have some programs for first-time home buyers, and of course, some for repeat buyers. We have household income limits and sales price limits, maximums, not minimums. We offer home buyer education, and that is also a requirement. And we finance single family properties only, no duplexes or multifamily properties. And we help with the primary residence only. So no investment properties and no second homes with Virginia Housing. So let's talk a little bit about our first-time home buyer requirement. Okay, so take a look at our definition. An individual who hasn't had ownership interest in their primary residence within the last 3 years. Do you see a loophole there? Because I do, and I did as an originator, and I used it all the time. This definition allows lots of people to get access to our programs who might not have access to any other assistance. So think about folks who are in the military. They own a home in Texas. They're now stationed here in Virginia. They've been here for 3 years and they want to put down roots. We get to treat them like a first-time home buyer. For people who are separated or divorced, their name may still be on the marital property, though they no longer live in it. They want to put down roots, attain new home ownership individually. If they've not been in the residence that they own for the last 3 years, we treat them like a first-time home buyer. Our guidelines for credit scores are very, very reasonable. For government-backed loans, FHA, VA, and rural housing loans, also known as USDA loans, our minimum required credit score is 620. For conventional loans, 640. And if you're going to use our plus second mortgage, taking advantage of the extra 1.5% financing, all borrowers must have a 680 credit score or higher. Now let's talk about these income limits. Now, this is our chart for the entire state of Virginia that is broken down into MSAs. However, we're going to focus on Northern Virginia. This territory is from Arlington down to Fredericksburg. In the first column, you see it for our grant income limit. Households of 2 or fewer with a household income of 141 or less have access to our grant. Households of 3 or more with a household income of 164,000 also have access to our grants. For those households that have higher incomes, they may not have our grant, but they still are able to use our bond mortgage loans. And our bond mortgage loans have an interest rate that's 0.25% lower than our non-bond mortgage loans. In addition, they may also have access to SPARK. And SPARK stands for Sponsoring Partnerships and Revitalizing Communities. It's a special allocation of funding from our REACH fund that we use to subsidize the interest rate for first-time home buyers. That subsidy is a 1% interest rate reduction that is permanent and is not tied to credit score and does not increase costs for the consumer at all. SPARK is the one program that we have that's outward facing or consumer facing that is first come, first serve. Our grants are funded consistently throughout the year. SPARK, because it comes directly from our net proceeds. Once the allocation has been utilized, we need to wait until the next round, which begins with our fiscal year in July 1. And then in this column on the far right, we have our expanded or non-bond programs. These loan programs and income limits are associated with first-time home buyers who have incomes that exceed the limits that we've already discussed, or for repeat buyers. And the difference for our non-bond loans from our bond loans is that this income limit is qualifying income only. So the household income limit on a non-bond loan or a repeat buyer loan can be higher because we're only counting the qualifying income of the borrowers here. We have sales price limits, and you can see in Northern Virginia for those who utilize our grant program, it's $750,000 as a sales price limit, as well as those using our bond loan and perhaps SPARK, maximum sales price $750,000 in Northern Virginia. However, if you're using our non-bond or our expanded limits program, there is no sales price limit, and you follow the GSE insurer and guarantor's maximum loan limit as long as it's not the high cost limit. And this is how each MSA is broken down to show or to reflect which cities and counties are included in each MSA. And so localities that are not listed here, for example, Winchester, would be included in the all other areas limits on both of our charts for income and sales price. So now let's talk about the fun stuff, our specialty programs. We have, oh, first I have to tell you this. In fiscal year 2024, Virginia Housing had the privilege of helping 4,055 households attain homeownership. 50% of those borrowers received either our closing cost assistance grant or our down payment assistance grant. 13% of those borrowers, of the 4,055 borrowers, received Spark, that 1% interest rate reduction. And out of all of our borrowers in fiscal year 24, 96.1% of our borrowers received some type of assistance from Virginia Housing, in addition to the first mortgage. So now let's talk about our DPA grant, or our down payment assistance grant. If the borrower's using a conventional bond loan, they would receive a 2% grant based on the lesser of the sales price or appraised value. If they're doing a FHA loan, it would be 2.5%. We increase the DPA on the FHA loan because the down payment is higher. And by doing this, we ensure that whether your client or the borrower is purchasing with a conventional loan or an FHA loan, they just need 1% to cover the balance of the home when using our down payment assistance. We have a first-time home buyer requirement. We've already looked at the reduced income limits for our grants. We count household income, and of course, you may layer this product with other community lending products according to the agency's guidelines. Now, for those who are using a VA loan or a rural housing loan, also known as a USDA loan, those products are already 100% financing. So we created the CCA, or Closing Cost Assistance Grant. It is a flat 2% of the appraised value or sales price, whichever is lower, and it is intended to cover closing costs. The CCA and the DPA are true gifts. There is no payment associated with them. They are not recorded anywhere, and we forget these grants faster than a family member would. So that's it for grants. Now, what about people who either don't want to put in a big down payment or any down payment at all, or perhaps they need a little help with the down payment? They can make the monthly payment just fine, but the down payment is the barrier. For those people, we have our plus second mortgage. And we have two ways to use it. You can use it behind our bond loans, which are intended for first-time home buyers, and you may use it behind our non-bond loans that is intended for the use of repeat buyers or buyers with higher incomes. Now, on a conventional loan that requires a 3% down payment with a minimum credit score of 640, one may have a 3% second mortgage. With an FHA loan and the minimum score of a 620, they may have the 3.5% down payment, giving them 100% financing. But those same borrowers, should their credit scores exceed or be equal or exceed 680, they can borrow an extra 1.5% on the second mortgage, giving them a 101.5% financing. So what is that for? What's the extra finance, the extra 1.5% for? It helps with closing costs. And it can make a significant difference in when one is able to buy a home, because they don't have to take a long time to save for a down payment. Now, let's take a look at the loan in action. I'm about to share with you an example of how Virginia housing can be paired with other community lending products to expand affordability in Northern Virginia. Currently, the City of Alexandria, Arlington, Prince William, Loudoun counties have down payment assistance programs. Some of these counties also have, or cities have, an employee assistance program that will also help them purchase a home. And so this is a simple example from Arlington counties using its MyPAP program. Their maximum sales price on a unit is $500,000. In this example, we will show that there's no help from the seller. We're using a modest credit score of 660 and an household income of $120,560 for a household of 4. And we're going to look at this transaction 3 different ways. In the first, we have no assistance. The borrower is going to do a conventional loan with 3% down, and they're going to come to the table with closing costs and the 3% down payment, totaling $30,770. And let's take a look at that housing payment over here. We have a 7.625% interest rate, tax and insurance, mortgage insurance, which is high. And this mortgage insurance is unusually high because generally someone getting a conventional loan would have a credit score that is significantly higher than 660. But to keep all of the examples the same, we're using a conventional loan for this first scenario as well. And then, of course, in Arlington, anything priced at $500,000 is going to be a condo and have a condo fee associated. And I chose a fair one of $500 a month. This brings our total housing payment with no assistance and 3% down to $4,861. That is about a 48% debt to income ratio at this point for the home alone. Now, let's add Arlington's DPA called MyPAP. Suddenly, same sales price, same closing costs, but now we have a lower loan to value. We have a significantly lower loan amount because we have this beautiful $112,500 second. It has no interest and no payments associated with it and no prepayment penalty from Arlington. We have a 7.375% interest rate with Virginia Housing, property taxes and insurance, and no MI because we have a substantial down payment, greater than 20%. We still have this condo fee, but now our total housing payment is $3,778, saving the borrower $1,083 a month or $12,996 each year that they keep the home and the loan. But now there's more. Let's use everything we have at our disposal. We're using the Virginia Housing First Mortgage, Virginia Housing Spark, the Virginia Housing DPA grant, and the Arlington DPA MyPAP. And here you see the example on the left. Our loan to value has gone down to 77.6%, reducing our loan amount by 2%. We've added the $10,000 or 2% Virginia Housing grant, reducing closing costs from the original quote of $30,707 to cash needed at settlement, $5,007. That's it. A $25,700 savings at settlement. But then let's take a look at the housing payment. Because we have sparked the 1% interest rate reduction, we've been able to reduce the rate from 7.375 to 6.375. Forgive me. Sorry. Okay. So we've reduced the interest rate from 7.375 to 6.375. We have no mortgage insurance still because of our hefty down payment. We still have that condo fee, but we've reduced the monthly total housing payment to $3,450, saving the borrower $1,411 every single month. The same borrower, the same property, the same income. But we've reduced that initial 48% DTI, or debt to income ratio, down to 34% with this loan structure. And believe it or not, there are other down payment assistance products that could have been added potentially or used in place of others. The state of Virginia through DHCD has a 10% down payment assistance program that's offered statewide. Some lenders have other DPA programs that they utilize in-house. And then the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta funds money every year with their partners to offer down payment assistance that could have easily been added to this transaction to make it more affordable. Now, I've shared with you a lot of information in a short amount of time, but if you're interested in learning about more Virginia housing programs and how they might work for you or those that you know, please take a moment to look at our lending wizard. Our lending wizard is a great tool to help you determine which Virginia housing programs may help you with financing. Thank you.
Thanks, Regina. You sure do make home buying look doable.
It is doable. It is.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Michael Spotts, who will be presenting opportunities to fill Nova's housing market gaps, building on best practices. Michael is the Vice President of Real Estate Development for Habitat for Humanity of Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia. Prior to joining Habitat in 2022, he was the founder and president of Neighborhood Fundamentals, LLC, and served as the Senior Visiting Research Fellow for the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center for Housing. I apologize, Michael, I didn't practice that in advance. He has nearly 20 years of experience providing research and technical assistance to the on-the-ground practitioners in both the public and private sectors at every level of government and in urban, suburban, and rural areas. Prior to founding Neighborhood Fundamentals, he worked for Enterprise Community Partners, Inc. from 2009 to 2017 as part of the public policy team. During this time, he conducted research and analysis of affordable housing and community development policies. Michael now serves on the board of directors for the Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance and previously served on the board of directors of the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. Michael, thank you. I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for the opportunity to join you all today to talk about this important topic. My presentation is about the opportunities that we have to fill the gaps that we have in the Northern Virginia market. And it's informed both by my current role as an affordable housing developer at Habitat, pardon me, at Habitat DC Nova, as well as that background that I have in housing policy research focused on identifying best practices to advance housing affordability. I'm going to start by talking about the types of housing we'll need to produce more of to make sure Northern Virginia continues to be a place where families of all sizes and incomes can live, work, and thrive. Though I agree with Jim that we should be building more in Roanoke and elsewhere in the state, and I think that that is important, I think we also can be doing more here to make housing more affordable. Then we'll talk about specific opportunities for addressing housing supply imbalances and market gaps, with a focus on providing an example of what's already being done in the region that can be expanded and otherwise built upon. And finally, I'll close by talking about some broader principles for consideration in future policy-making efforts. Starting with first principles, let's recap who is being underserved by the current market and the characteristics of the types of housing they might be looking for. As the report shows, young adults who are earlier in their careers, have lower income, and are either single or recently married and may be moving to start or expand their family and or find more affordable and spacious housing are more likely to leave the region. Based on the report findings and experience in research and in the field, it's reasonable to focus on working to produce housing that is A, more attainable, B, provides more space to accommodate growing households, and C, is located in a manner that enables them to maximize employment opportunities. But what does this actually mean in practice? Drilling down into these characteristics, there are a range of actions that can be taken. On the subject of attainability, It's important to make sure we don't lose sight of the macro level circumstances when we're trying to focus in on specific housing typologies. Our region needs more housing of all types. Just because we need a proactive strategy to produce more 3-bedroom or larger units to provide more space to families doesn't mean that we should inhibit the construction of studios or smaller apartments. A lack of supply in one segment concentrates demand in others. If the recent college grads that are splitting the rent of a single-family home or the downsizing empty nester have desirable apartments or condos they can move into, that can free up those larger units for households that need the space. And while adding market rate supply is critical, it's important to invest in affordable housing directly and create more income restricted units. And while we've made great strides in the region in supporting affordable rental development and preservation efforts, even if there's more to be done there, this report underscores the importance of investing in affordable homeownership specifically, given the dearth of entry-level homes attainable to low and middle income households. In terms of providing more space, we have to remove barriers to developing more diverse housing product types and tenures. This can include larger rental units, including in single-family or townhome build-to-rent communities. Conversely, our region is also at a point of its build-out that we cannot address households' need for more space through detached single-family homes alone. However, Habitat DC Nova and other builders across the region have had experience building highly sought-after mid-density unit typologies, 3 or 4-bedroom townhomes, duplexes, and condos, which often also include some amount of private or shared outdoor space that we know lots of families are looking for. Finally, we need to be thinking about where we're building. We've experienced the pendulum of work from home swing in one direction in conjunction with the pandemic, and now, at least partially, we may be starting to see it swing back in the other direction with return to office directives. The experience of the last 5 years should give us a degree of humility as we try to predict which locations may be in highest demand. As such, our approach should be less about pinpointing growth opportunities and more of a broad-based effort to make the entire region as accommodating of sustainable growth as possible. This will look very different in different places. In inner Northern Virginia, the focus may be on increasing and diversifying housing supply in areas with existing infrastructure. As we shift further out, it will be imperative to focus on building not just housing units, but the types of communities with the connectivity and assets that will make them desirable to growing families, while still being sustainable from an environmental and fiscal management perspective. So without further ado, let's get to some specific examples of opportunities that we can seize in this region. The first approach to highlight is the work that's being done to leverage our infrastructure investments and build new transit-oriented communities. In recent years, Fairfax and Loudoun counties have adopted proactive policies that promote investment in Silver Line station areas. In some station areas, this has included ownership-oriented townhome construction, though in others the units have been primarily smaller multifamily. The specific tools that can be leveraged include rezonings, form-based codes, or other forms of zoning flexibility that facilitate greater density. To highlight a specific policy, Fairfax's Tyson's plans and requirements provide additional density proximate to station areas and include requirements for income-restricted affordable housing in exchange for yet higher density in this employment center. Zooming out to takeaways for policy and practice, planning for additional growth near our job centers and transportation infrastructure in particular can directly improve location efficiency and access to jobs. The extent to which such plans and policies improve attainability and/or result in housing units with more space is a matter of intentionality and policy design, but these are goals that certainly can be accomplished via this intervention. Another way to promote housing solutions near our existing infrastructure is to focus on what is already there. There's been a considerable amount of attention paid to the adaptive reuse of obsolete office buildings and campuses as a means to add more housing supply and address declining occupancy and property tax revenues from this market. Focusing on vertical opportunities, by which I mean conversion of existing buildings, there have been a number of projects that have been completed in recent years. This map uses the highly scientific sampling method of focusing on conversions that are in close proximity to walking distance of my house. Within a relatively small portion of Fairfax, Arlington, and Alexandria, just alone there are 3 projects there and more than 1,250 units that have been produced through office to residential conversions. So while this is admittedly an anecdotal sample and the scale of density is not found elsewhere in all areas throughout the region, there's still an opportunity to be had if local governments can focus on working to remove the zoning, permitting, and code barriers to such projects. Another characteristic that's interesting is that a number of these projects have been marketed as live-work units, which could provide another housing option for remote and or hybrid workers, or for those that are working to branch out on their own and set up their own business. As for the other impact areas, the supply boost these units contributes to attainability by addressing our overall supply imbalance. It does remain to be seen if there are scalable opportunities to provide larger units through these projects and larger and family size units because you're working within the existing floor plate of these buildings and your options may be a little bit more limited. That being said, adaptive reuse can take multiple forms. In addition to retrofitting existing, often high-rise buildings, there are opportunities for horizontal adaptive reuse, in which lower density office parks are redeveloped as residential and/or mixed-use communities. These sites are generally still well served by existing infrastructure and may still keep some of the portion of the site as is. The example of the screen is the recently approved Hunters Branch redevelopment in Fairfax County, which is reusing the existing office parking structure. However, since there is usually some level of demolition in new construction, there are generally more opportunities to design for larger unit sizes such as townhomes with access to green space. Certain lower density retail sites can also present an opportunity for redevelopment. Interestingly, redevelopment of such sites is not an all or nothing proposition. I'm sharing an example of a project near the intersection of Graham Road and Route 50 in Fairfax County. The developer, EYA, built townhomes with common space and a playground on a portion of what was originally a large strip-style retail property. All housing was built on the west portion of the site, with retail, which includes a grocery store, consolidated on the eastern portion of the parcel. The prior examples are important for demonstrating market opportunities that could be leveraged. The local and county government role in these examples is to focus on planning, zoning, code, and property tax policies to remove barriers to development. They can also layer in incentives for affordability, such as density bonuses and fee waivers. However, local jurisdictions also have tools at their disposal to more directly meet housing needs. One of the most powerful is the use of their own land. One of the groundbreaking examples was the Arlington Mill Residences, 100% affordable property in Arlington County, built by the developer now known as True Ground Housing Partners, formerly Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. The project was built on public land and includes rental homes and a community center over a shared parking structure. In subsequent years, Fairfax County has utilized this tool a number of times using a systematic approach. Virginia state law allows jurisdictions to establish processes for accepting both solicited and unsolicited proposals for developing on public land, often co-located with community facilities. PPEA projects, as they're known, have or will be used to produce housing of all types, including market rate and income restricted units, senior housing, homeownership units, and rentals. The use of public land is one of the most powerful tools that we have in our toolkit for making progress along all three impact areas identified. So the previous examples primarily focused on how we can achieve our goals by leveraging targeted opportunities, specific neighborhood and building types, public land, etc. The last two examples I'll profile attack the challenge from a different angle, adopting broad-based policies to incentivize specific types of housing. First, focusing on housing type. There have been a number of zoning efforts, both at the state and local level across the country, to enable more missing middle zoning that allows townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, and small multifamily and condo structures, either by right or on a streamlined manner. I think that's something that's really important to consider, and Alexandria and Arlington have already taken up this effort, although their policy changes have been tied up in litigation. It kind of shows how controversial this challenge is, but this does represent, in my mind, especially in our urban core areas and in infill locations, one of the best opportunities that we have to expand the housing typology for home ownership beyond the single family detached units that are becoming increasingly scarce and less affordable. And in addition to zoning for specific unit types, you can provide specific zoning incentives for affordable housing. An example here is Cambridge, Massachusetts, which recently passed a zoning overlay that combines greater density with affordability requirements. You get more height if at least 20% of your units are affordable. So while my presentation is mostly focused on development-sized solutions, I want to highlight that this list is non-exhaustive and that there are a number of other critical programs and supports that can better support individual households in their search for housing that meets their life circumstances or supports developers in making homes they build to be more affordable. You've heard about some of these tools in my colleagues' presentations. I'll just briefly add here that we get more bang for our buck with these tools if we're able to streamline the processes and make the development process more efficient. So just very briefly in closing, so we can have time for Q&A, just want to offer some higher level takeaways for specific policy making efforts. Just reiterating what I've mentioned in the past, that it's important to have zoning flexibility and process efficiency, that the more units we build overall, it's important, but it's not just important to look at the unit count, but also the types of units that we're building. And that while we need market rate development to solve the challenge overall, we're not going to get all the way there without a significant and substantial investment in committed affordable housing. And then finally, given changing technology and work structures, I think it's prudent to assume that the volatility of the last couple of decades, and the last 5 years in particular, could be here to stay. This brings me back to the point of policy flexibility and adaptability. It can take years, and in some cases longer, to reform policies. If we're trying to solve the challenges of 2025, with a policy that won't go into effect until 2027 or 2028, there's an increasing likelihood that we'll miss the mark on the policy specifics. Rather than trying to micromanage specific outcomes in all cases, a better approach may be to develop flexible policies that can succeed across market cycles and shifts in demand. That's easier said than done, but I look forward to continuing to work with the leaders on this session and in the call to work to make that a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks to all of our panelists. Everyone has provided a plethora of information to really out. And so I'd like to move into the questions. We have 7 here. We may be able to get through all of them. We'll start off with Mark's question. This may be a question for both Jill and for Jim. Please feel free to answer, whoever has the expertise. Mark says, when will we see the net negative migration and housing cost reductions? I.e., if we continually have negative net migration, shouldn't housing costs at least level off, if not go down slightly? However, that is not obviously happening.
I think with the short supply of housing in our region and the high demand that there is, that this issue likely can't be solved for quite some time, decades possibly, unless these other solutions that have been talked about and changes to zoning actually occur. So I think we're going to definitely see the negative migration continue for quite some time, unless living conditions change, like if the new generations and the young generations possibly like start buying homes together, multiple families buying homes together, things like that, it won't change. And Jim, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so via work in like rural areas and Rust Belt metros, there's a lot of places that have declining populations and housing availability problems. And sometimes it's a matter of looking at it instead of a number of households is bedrooms. So you have people who've aged in place. It might have 5 bedrooms. This is particularly acute in rural areas. And then there's just a remaining mother, grandmother, and that house would normally represent first-time homebuyer opportunity, but there's no place for the current resident to go. And so that will have a lot to do with the kinds, the quality of our housing solutions that I think Michael did a great job of highlighting is thinking through these different kinds of approaches and looking at the demographics. So it's not so much do we get to a better domestic migration flip, is that understanding the demographic patterns and then having the appropriate housing policies in place.
Thank you, Jim and Jill. We have a question from Kenny, who I wanted to give him an opportunity to elaborate, but I don't see Kenny here. So we'll do our best based on the question here. This was towards one of your charts, Jill. It says, how, if at all, does the chart figure in condo fees, which are a factor for most anything under 400K? Mine, for instance, they are $650 a month on top of my mortgage. So I'm not sure which chart that refers to.
Sure which chart he is referring to, but I imagine it was the housing burden chart where we showed the ownership and renter. Those figures for renter and ownership cost include all the housing related expenses, whether that be your taxes, your condo fees, and any other expenses, utilities that are part of your monthly expenses.
Okay, thank you. Allison has a question asking, how long does it take the average household at each income level to gather the required capital for home ownership? How does that change affordability calculations when it comes down to an affordable home price?
Regina, do you think you could take a stab at that one?
You want me to repeat it?
Yes,
Sure.
please. Thank you.
Okay. How long does it take the average household at each income level to gather the required capital for home ownership? How does that change affordability calculations when it comes to an affordable home price?
That is a question that I cannot answer precisely because everything's different. Even if households have the same income, they may have different expenses, childcare, sending money to their parents, and different things like that. So the amount of time it takes them is going to definitely vary. However, I have had the privilege of being an originator, a loan officer who didn't have to tell my clients to wait until they saved enough money. Because you're absolutely right. The time it takes to save enough money to put down 5, 10, 15, 20% of a sales price, especially in Northern Virginia, the prices are going to increase on you. So it's all an ever-changing finish line, so to speak, right? To ensure that you have enough money down. That's why programs like ours at Virginia Housing and the other loan programs and assistance programs from localities and the state of Virginia are so important because I didn't have to tell my clients, oh, go save $15,000, $20,000 from your net income, not your gross that lenders use to calculate qualification, but from your net income. I didn't have to tell them that because I had so many tools available to say yes right now.
Thank you. We have just a couple more. I don't know if people want to stay on just a few more minutes. We have an anonymous question. What kinds of trends are we seeing in housing investor activity, such as house flippers, Airbnbs, single family rentals, etc.? I don't know if that's a Michael question.
I don't have hard data on this. The trends, we got to kind of take some of the different categories of investor activity separately. So house flippers, Airbnb, single family rentals, they're all kind of different categories. And my general perspective on this is the impact of that in the aggregate, if we're looking at the region, is probably pretty minimal overall. But what you see in specific neighborhoods, you might have some substantial issues. So, for example, you might have an issue with Airbnbs where it could create some crowding out of permanent housing solutions in areas where there's heavier tourist demand. Think Old Town around in and around Old Town Alexandria, for example. Single family rentals, that might be more of an issue in more exurban areas where investors can come in and buy single family homes at a slightly lower cost. So further out in the outskirts, you might have some challenges. House flippers, you do see that a little bit more spread out. But that's another different type of investment activity. I live in Arlington where most single family homes, or I shouldn't say most single family homes because I don't have the specific data in front of me, but a lot of single family homes do get purchased. And whereas it might need a little bit of TLC, a little bit of deferred maintenance, those are being renovated, popped up, torn down, etc., via house flipping and new construction into unaffordable, sometimes 4,000, 5,000, in some cases 6,000 square foot homes. So, those are in the highest demand neighborhoods in the urban core. So I think I don't have specific data that I can give you a comprehensive answer, but I think it is neighborhood and context specific.
Thank you, Mike. We have a quick shout out to to Jim from Mark. Mark says, thanks for mentioning Roanoke. I grew up in Roanoke. It is nice that Roanoke has become relevant again. Next question, from Michelle to Regina. Does Virginia Housing provide mortgages for individual condominium units?
Yes, we finance manufactured homes on a permanent foundation, single family homes, and condominiums.
Thank you, Regina. Another one here is single room occupancy SRO available for office to residential conversion. Some West Coast states have explored this with building code updates / changes, and I don't know if Virginia has. I think, Michael, that might have been asked during your presentation.
Yeah, I'm not aware of examples of situations in which office or residential in Virginia has been converted to single room occupancy. This would be just mostly a local code challenge. This is not something we wouldn't have to rely on from the state level of government for enabling legislation, but as long as the local codes allow it, or more likely, they would facilitate it as part of a rezoning for a specific parcel. That could be a possibility.
Thank you. And we have a couple of follow-up questions to the original first question, Jill and Jim. It says, from Sean, follow-up to first question about negative migration and short supply. How much does the current interest rate environment contribute to the shortage of housing in the area? Meaning, when interest rates drop, shouldn't we see a huge increase in supply from sellers currently protecting their low rate?
Yes, I would agree that our trends in Northern Virginia and the large jurisdictions in the US that are not affordable have really paralleled the interest rates trends. So during the pandemic, when the interest rates were at record lows, we saw the huge outmigration, partly because of the housing supply freeing up and people leaving, and so others being able to replace those who left. And then as the rates have gone up from 2022 to now, we've clearly seen the trend going down in our outmigration. And that's been the case throughout the country for the large and mid-size communities. And even for the large and mid-sized metro areas that are attracting people that are more affordable, such as your Nashville, Atlanta, and Austin, they have all seen drops over the past 2 years in their in-migration. And again, I believe that's attributed largely due to this interest rate trend that we've been seeing, and that's really confining people and restricting people's movement.
Yeah, I would just add to that the looking at existing housing market dynamics, that people who are locked in with low mortgage rates are, they may have needs to move, but do not want to give up these low rates. And so therefore, you're probably looking at a case where they may want to move to a place that has more room, but they're not doing so because the increase in interest rates. And so we're talking about a lot of first-time homebuyer opportunities. So then the upstream effect is that people who are normally leaving rentals for these first-time homebuyer opportunities, those rentals, they're staying put too. So the lock-in effect isn't just with homeowners; it's also with renters as well as it functionally gums up the housing ladder.
If
So
I can
I would
just
just,
add one thing, I would say that we should be cognizant of the fact that the current interest rate environment is not the historical aberration. The 2% to low 4% interest rate environment was in post Great Recession, early stages of the pandemic. If you look at the long run, that is the historical aberration. So while I think that I agree with everything that was just previously said, but I do think that I don't think we're going to see a massive wave of new supply opening up all at once because of interest rates dropping, in part because I don't think interest rates are going to drop suddenly and quickly to the same level of where you're going to be able to swap out your 3% mortgage for another 3% mortgage in the next 3 to 5 years. I think there's definitely some room for them to fall further, consistent with historical trends. But yeah, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if they never get below five in outside of a crisis or some other intervention for a long time. So I think that will mute any supply shocks. I think it could reduce the impact of that lock-on effect, but I don't see a world in which we're going to have this huge flood of inventory in the DMV all at once that's going to really negatively impact prices right now because there is still demand for people to move in if homes were cheaper.
yes, and I would agree with Michael on that these upcoming years and going forward are interest rates. Economists are not foreseeing them going back to those historic lows that we really are back to, like the long-term averages right now, like 5%, 6% historically. And so in the coming years, including this year, I don't think we're going to be seeing that pattern of the outmigration following the interest rate trends going forward. It's going to be different times now, especially with the federal impacts and the ripple effect from that, where people will be leaving not for the interest rates, but because of job layoffs and having to find careers elsewhere, but also the large number of retirements that are bound to come over these next few years that will free up the supply in some respect.
Thank you. Regina, I saw you shaking your head on some things. I didn't know if you wanted to add a comment or not. I didn't want to take that opportunity from you. You're good. Okay. Thanks everyone for holding on with us and for staying a little bit longer. We have one quick final question. It's just a follow-up from Michelle about the first question. It says, just to clarify, that last question about negative net migration didn't consider the positive international migration that continues to keep our population growing. Is that right?
That's correct. We were looking at the domestic migration, which is the movement within our country, and not the international migration, which you are correct. That is certainly the component that is keeping our growth going in this region, along with the natural births and natural change that we have. But without international migration, our region would be losing the population, except for in 2024. This is the first time, I think it was since 2018, where natural increase exceeded the domestic migration. So natural increase did keep our population growing as well in the 2023 to 2024 period. But for the most part, lately, past several years, it's been international migration since 2021 that has been the main driver.
And I would add quickly to that recent international migration numbers are relatively unprecedented and not likely to be sustained. And we're already seeing early indications of them dropping. Over the last couple of years, you're probably seeing really in terms of the overall trend, inflated population numbers, particularly for your largest metros. So I would expect the impact of international migration to become increasingly muted, at least in the near term. It's harder to say long term, but over the next few years, we're not going to be seeing something akin to like 2022 or 2023.
Thank you. Well, that is the end of the questions and or comments. Jill, I'll turn it over to you for our closing remarks.
So we want to thank all the presenters we had here today, Jim, Regina, and Michael. Thank you so much for the valuable information. And we really hope you all enjoyed and learned from this time. And any of you who are leaders or who know of leaders that would want to help with coming together and finding more solutions for our region, please join us October 6th. Save that date for that upcoming symposium. We will be sending you the recording and our presentations here this afternoon or tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Yes, a big thank you to our panelists, and thank you everyone for attending.